What if I told you that there's a chapter of Canadian history that is often kept hidden from the mainstream narrative? A chapter that is not just a footnote, but a significant part of the fabric of this nation. Today, we are peeling back the layers of time to reveal a painful and often overlooked part of Canada's past, the Indigenous residential school system. The Indigenous residential school system is not a relic of the distant past. Its inception in the 19th century marked a dark era in Canadian history. This system was not just a series of buildings or institutions, it was a deliberate and systematic attempt to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian society, a process that involved stripping them of their cultural identity, language, and traditions. The Government of Canada, in partnership with various Christian churches, played a key role in the establishment of this system. The aim was to civilize Indigenous children, to mold them into a shape that fit within the narrow confines of Euro-Canadian norms and values. But the reality was far removed from this stated goal. Instead of education and enlightenment, these children faced harsh conditions, abuse, and a relentless assault on their cultural identity. It's crucial to recognize that this wasn't a minor misstep or an unfortunate side effect of well-intentioned policies. No, this was a calculated strategy born from a belief in cultural superiority and the perceived need to suppress and erase Indigenous cultures. And the impact of this system was not confined to a single generation. It seeped into the lives of subsequent generations, leaving a trail of trauma, pain, and loss that continues to reverberate within Indigenous communities today. As we delve into this topic, it's essential to remember that this is not just history. This is a lived reality for many Indigenous people in Canada. Their stories, their experiences, and their resilience in the face of such adversity are central to understanding this part of Canadian history. Let us delve deeper into this untold chapter of history. We invite you to join us on this journey as we uncover the unseen history of Canada's Indigenous residential school system. The residential school system was not merely an educational institution, but a tool for cultural assimilation. This chilling truth forms the crux of our understanding of Canada's Indigenous residential school system. Its purpose was not to educate, but to erase, to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian society, stripping them of their cultural identity, their language, their traditions, and their ties to their families and communities. A policy of aggressive assimilation was put into place, a policy that was not just about teaching new ways, but about eradicating the old. The Canadian government and several Christian churches collaborated on this endeavor, convinced that the only way to civilize the Indigenous population was to Europeanize them, to make them forget their roots and embrace a completely different way of life. But how was this policy implemented? The method was as brutal as it was simple, forcibly removing children from their families and communities. Imagine the terror of being taken away from everything you know and love, at an age when you should be playing and learning under the watchful eyes of your parents, not strangers. Children as young as 4 or 5 were taken from their homes, often without the consent or even the knowledge of their parents. Once taken, these children were sent to residential schools, often located far away from their communities. The distance served a dual purpose. It made it harder for the children to run away and return home, and it made it easier to sever the ties between the children and their families, their communities, their culture. The children were not allowed to speak their native languages, wear traditional clothes, or practice their customs and traditions. Everything about their identity was systematically suppressed. They were given new names, new clothes, a new language. They were taught to be ashamed of who they were, of where they came from. This was just the beginning of a long, dark journey for these children, a journey that was marked by loss of identity, loss of family, loss of culture, a journey that we will continue to explore in the coming scenes. What was life like for the children in these schools, you ask? The reality was far from what you might expect. The living conditions were harsh, and the children were subjected to a grueling routine that was designed to strip them of their cultural identity. Imagine being a child, torn away from your family, your home, your culture, and thrust into an alien environment. The children were housed in dormitory-style accommodations, often overcrowded, with minimal privacy and comfort. The food was unfamiliar and often inadequate, leading to malnutrition, and medical care was woefully insufficient, resulting in widespread illness. The daily routine was rigid and militaristic. The children were woken early, made to scrub themselves clean, and then marched off to church services. Their days were filled with manual labor and rote learning. But the most damaging aspect was the systematic suppression of their indigenous languages and cultures. The children were forbidden from speaking their native languages, even among themselves. They were punished, often severely, if they were caught doing so. They were made to feel ashamed of their heritage, their customs, their beliefs. Their names, symbols of their individuality and their cultural identity, were often replaced with numbers or anglicized versions. The curriculum was designed to assimilate the children into Euro-Canadian society. It focused on teaching them basic English and arithmetic, along with skills deemed useful for manual labor. There was little to no instruction in history, science, or literature. The schools were not about education, but assimilation. The psychological and emotional toll this took on the children was immense. They were alienated from their families, their culture, and ultimately, from themselves. Many struggled with feelings of isolation, confusion, and self-hatred. The trauma inflicted by these schools has had a lasting impact, reverberating through generations. So when we ask, what was life like for the children in these residential schools, we are confronted with a grim reality. The schools were less about education and more about erasure of identity. The children were not just students, they were victims of a cultural genocide. The residential school system has left a lasting legacy on Indigenous communities. In the aftermath of these schools, the long-term effects have been profound and far-reaching. The survivors, now adults, carry with them the scars of a childhood spent in an environment that sought to erase their identity. This trauma doesn't simply disappear over time. It manifests in various ways, from mental health issues like anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, to struggles with substance abuse and higher rates of suicide. The pain doesn't stop with the survivors. It trickles down through generations, resulting in what experts have termed intergenerational trauma. The children and grandchildren of survivors are often raised by individuals still grappling with their past, leading to a cycle of trauma that continues to affect Indigenous communities today. The residential school system was not just a physical removal of children from their homes, but also a cultural one. The loss of language and culture has been staggering. Many Indigenous languages, once rich and vibrant, are now endangered or have completely vanished. The disconnection from their cultural roots has left many Indigenous peoples in a struggle for identity, caught between a past that was forcibly erased and a present that often feels alien. Then there's the loss of traditional knowledge. Indigenous cultures are deeply rooted in oral tradition, with knowledge passed down from generation to generation. The disconnection caused by the residential school system disrupted this flow of knowledge. Many Indigenous peoples are now striving to reclaim and revive their cultural practices and traditions, but the loss has been significant. Also, these schools have left a legacy of mistrust towards the education system and government institutions among Indigenous communities. This mistrust can act as a barrier to accessing services, opportunities, and rights, further exacerbating the social and economic disparities these communities face. The echoes of the system are still heard today. The long-term effects of the residential school system are a stark reminder of a dark chapter in Canada's history, a chapter that continues to reverberate through the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples, shaping their present and influencing their future. The road to recognition and reconciliation has been a long one. For decades, survivors of Canada's Indigenous residential school system have strived for acknowledgement, for a voice to be heard, for their stories to echo in the halls of justice. They have been the ones to carry the weight of the past, the torchbearers of truth, walking the road to recognition. The journey was not easy. It was laden with obstacles, with denials, with dismissals, but their resilience echoed louder than the voices that sought to silence them. They marched onward, carrying the memories of their lost childhoods, determined to bring to light the dark corners of Canada's history. The survivors and advocates did not walk alone. Many joined them in their march, standing shoulder to shoulder, amplifying their voices, calling for justice. Together, they brought attention to an issue that had been swept under the rug for far too long. Their efforts bore fruit in 2008 when the Canadian government issued an official apology for the painful legacy of the residential schools. It was a pivotal moment, a recognition of the wrongs done. Yet, an apology was just the beginning, the first step on the road to reconciliation. In the same year, the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission marked a significant milestone in this journey. The commission was tasked with uncovering the truth about the residential schools, documenting the stories of the survivors, and making recommendations for reconciliation. This was not just about the past, but about the present and the future as well. It was about acknowledging the harm done, understanding the impact, and working towards healing. It was about ensuring that such a tragedy never repeats itself. The road to recognition and reconciliation is long and winding, with many steps yet to be taken. But each step brings us closer to understanding, to healing, to justice. Acknowledgement is the first step towards healing. The survivors, the advocates, the allies, they all continue to walk this road, making sure that the stories of the residential schools are not forgotten, but remembered, learned from, and used as a guide on the path towards a just and inclusive future. Where does that leave us today, you might be wondering? Well, the echoes of the residential school system are still reverberating through Indigenous communities across Canada. The physical schools may have shut their doors decades ago, but the trauma they inflicted continues to bleed into the present. These communities are still grappling with the effects of the forced assimilation and cultural genocide that was inflicted upon them. The residential schools have left a lasting legacy of intergenerational trauma, broken families, and cultural dislocation. Mental health issues, substance abuse, and suicide rates are disproportionately high among Indigenous communities, a painful testament to the enduring impact of this dark chapter in history. And if that weren't enough, recent events have ripped open old wounds. The discovery of unmarked graves at former residential school sites has sent shockwaves through the nation. Hundreds upon hundreds of children, stripped of their names and their identities, were buried in anonymity, their stories untold and their fates unknown. This grim revelation is a chilling reminder that the residential school system was not just an assault on culture, but on life itself. Yet amid this bleak landscape, there is resilience. Indigenous communities are standing strong, preserving their languages, their traditions, and their identities against all odds. They are fighting for justice, for recognition, and for the right to heal. They are reclaiming their narratives and their histories, refusing to let the residential school system define them. The journey towards healing is long and fraught with challenges, but it is a journey that must be undertaken for the sake of those who suffered, those who were lost, and those who are yet to come. The past may be painful, and the present may be fraught, but the future can and must be different. The past continues to cast a long shadow on the present, but as long as we're willing to face it, to acknowledge it, and to learn from it, there is hope for a brighter, more equitable future. How can we move forward from this dark chapter? As we delve into the path forward, it's important to remember that the journey of healing isn't a solitary one. It's a collective effort, a shared responsibility. This path starts with education. It's vital that we continue to uncover, understand, and share the stories of the past. The history of Indigenous residential schools isn't just a part of Canadian history, it's a part of world history. It's a tale of resilience and survival, a testament to the spirit of Indigenous communities that have endured so much. Understanding, you see, is the first step towards reconciliation. It's about acknowledging the past, recognizing the harm done, and most importantly, learning from it. It's about changing the narrative, shifting the perspective from one of victimhood to one of strength and resilience. But understanding isn't enough. We need to provide ongoing support to Indigenous communities. This means extending a hand of friendship, offering resources, opportunities, and a platform for their voices to be heard. It means ensuring that their basic rights are upheld and their needs are met. Preserving Indigenous languages and cultures is another critical step on this path. These languages and cultures carry centuries of wisdom, knowledge, and traditions. They are the backbone of Indigenous identity and the conduit through which their stories are passed from one generation to the next. Preserving them is not just about keeping a language alive, it's about keeping a people's history, their very essence, intact. But we must remember that preservation isn't just about looking back, it's about looking forward too. It's about creating spaces where Indigenous cultures can evolve, grow, and adapt, while still staying true to their roots. We must strive for a future where every child, Indigenous or otherwise, can grow up knowing the true history of their country, understanding the strength and resilience of its Indigenous peoples, and appreciating the rich tapestry of cultures that make up its identity. Healing is a journey, and it's one that we must take together. Let's revisit what we've learned today. We've journeyed through the unseen history of Canada's Indigenous residential school system. We've understood its purpose and implementation, the life within these schools, and the long-term effects it has had on generations. We've seen the road to recognition, the current situation, and the path forward. This isn't just a chapter in a history book, it's a lived reality for many, and an integral part of Canadian history. The importance of acknowledging this cannot be overstated. Working towards reconciliation is a collective effort. It's about understanding, empathy, and action. It's about ensuring every child matters, every voice is heard, and every story is told. And above all, it's about learning from our past to shape a more inclusive future. Remember, understanding our past is crucial for shaping a more inclusive future. This video was brought to you by PPCM TV, PPCM Canada, Media Limited, and True Crime and Justice TV, sponsored by Carry Movers Limited. Thank you for watching.